All right, so it is 6 o'clock and I will go ahead and get started with tonight's program. For those who have just joined, my name is Rebecca Golden. I am a co-owner of Bee and Bloom, and we're working with Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District tonight to do a overwintering webinar about where bees go in the winter. So this presentation will be recorded, added to the Soil and Water Conservation District YouTube channel, and a link to the recorded presentation and all of the slides and follow-up materials will be emailed to you after the class. I also believe that the webinar is set up to do a post-class survey. So if you are able and willing to spend a couple extra minutes tonight on that, just let us know what you think of the programming or other things you might be interested in. That would be really amazing and really helpful. And for those of you who are not familiar with soil and water conservation districts, it's a really amazing conservation resource. It is a community organized conservation project that is run by the state of Oregon. They do a lot of conservation education and webinars like this. Back before 2020, we did some in-person workshops and programming with them as well, but they also have native plant sales and technical support for conservation projects, some cost share programs and grant funding, and all of that is really amazing as well, just so you know what kind of resources you have out there. So we'll dive into tonight's program. And our agenda for the evening is going to be to discuss the common types of bees in the Pacific Northwest and what we might see in the Oregon area, the different types of life cycles that all these different groups of bees have, and how they'll actually incorporate that winter season into their life cycle, how to support bees throughout every season, but also with an emphasis on things that you can do before winter or coming right out of winter in order to support them and get them through kind of those cold, a little bit rougher months. All right. So I'd like to start with just a little primer on bees. I'd like to introduce a concept that bees are incredibly diverse. There are an estimated 4,000 species of bee in North America. And in Oregon, there's an estimated 500 different species of bee. And so this one here is probably the one species that most people are familiar with. This is the European honeybee. And they're the ones with the queen and then lots of worker bees, the only species that actually makes honey. But there are so many more different types of bees out there. The largest bee in North America can fit the smallest bee in North America on its eye. And so they come in many different sizes, colors, they might have hairs in different parts of their body, and they'll also have different social strategies, different nesting habits, all different types of ways to interact with flowers and with the environment. And so the main thing that makes a bee is going to be its phylogeny. And so it's an insect that's really closely related to ants and wasps. It will get all of its food from flowers. So protein from pollen, and then carbohydrates and sugars and other essential amino acids and things from nectar. And as a result of gathering all of their food from flowers, they're providing a really essential service to the plant itself by moving its pollen between flowers in order for that plant to produce seeds and, in a lot of cases, fruit. But 90% of bees are solitary. And so I'm going to be using a term native bee. And so what I'm meaning by the phrase native bee are bees that are endemic to a particular region or an ecosystem. And so there are many non-native bees that we have in Oregon and in North America, but they were all moved by humans in some way usually, or they've traveled with climate change or moved farther north with climate change. But a lot of times they're either intentionally introduced, like in the case of honeybees, and then certain bumblebee species have been intentionally introduced, or they've found a way to hitch a ride into across the Rockies, usually into these areas where they are not endemic to. But 90% of those native bees are going to be solitary. So those are just a single female that is making a nest of her own offspring. Those offspring will develop inside of their nests for the majority of the year, and then they'll be the next generation in the next year. And we'll dive more into the details of that life cycle throughout the presentation tonight. Most of those will nest in the ground, and so they'll dig tunnels into usually non-compact earth. Some prefer a sandier soil, some prefer a more clay texture, some like to be on a slope, some will be on riverbanks. So they'll have many different preferences for where they'll dig their tunnels in the ground, but most of those are going to be making their own nests and excavating their own nests in the ground. Most bees are incredibly non-defensive. So all female bees do have stingers, but most of them are not very quick to use it. And so they'll only use that as a last line of defense, usually if they're being constricted. So if they're grabbed in a hand or stepped on, but even then, if predators or other non-suspecting animals stumble across their nesting sites, they'll usually either stay in or flee rather than coming out and defending. And so they're very non-defensive. And then most of them are pollinators. So I did mention that what makes a bee is that they get all of their food from flowers, but there are always exceptions to that rule. And so there are some bees that are carnivorous that have popped out of the woodwork, and they won't be providing pollination services. There are some bees that are what we call brood parasites, and I'll get into what that means a little bit later as well, but they aren't providing the same level of pollination services as bees that are actively collecting pollen on external features on their bodies to bring back to their nests. All right. So that brings me to honeybees. Honeybees are very unique in how they incorporate winter into their life cycle. And so there's only one species in North America, and it's European. It was introduced in the 1600s as a producer of honey and beeswax. And humans have this very close cultural relationship with honeybees. We keep them in hives, and we're very integral to their life cycle at this point, at least in North America. There are some feral colonies that will live in tree hollows without any human intervention, but most of the honeybee species most of the honeybees, colonies, not species, will rely on a beekeeper or man-made hives in order to survive. They're the only producer of honey, so they gather nectar from flowers, they bring it back to the hive, and then they dehydrate that nectar down to about 14% water content. And so that is when it becomes honey, it turns into this spoil-proof winter food. So it has such a low water content that bacteria and fungal spores or molds can't actually survive in the solution. And so it is shelf stable, and that will be their food inside of the hive for the entire winter period. So it's kind of like canning. And so they'll be actively alive and cluster around their honey stores, eating that food that they've stored up and saved through the summer to survive the winter. And they're the only species that does that, who will actively survive as a colony all year. This is the seasonality chart of a honeybee. Since they are a species that will live throughout the entire season, we can kind of trace their activity and their population numbers throughout the season and see that it's completely intertwined with when flowers are in bloom. So they'll go through that dormant phase where they are inside the hive eating honey and only leaving in order to do cleansing flights, which is their excreting waste and defecating outside of the hive. It's a hygienic behavior, but otherwise they will stay in, and they'll only do that on the sunniest and hottest days. But then spring comes around and the first blooms start popping out, and they'll start foraging for pollen, which is their protein source, and that's what they feed their young. And so that's really when they build their population up a lot. If they're very successful at that, they'll do something called swarming. in this middle part of the season. So that's when colonies will split in half and find new nesting sites. So it's kind of like cell division of one colony into two. And then in summertime is when they kind of switch their priorities. And so they'll go from building up populations and building up numbers to gathering as much nectar as they can and producing and storing as much honey as they can. So that's through the summer months and into fall. And then usually toward the end of October, they will stop coming out quite so much, unless it's really warm, which isn't unheard of in recent years. You'll still see honeybee activity into November often. But usually once flowers have stopped blooming and once temperatures have cooled below 55 every day consistently, they'll just stay in the hive until the following spring again. And so they're very, very unique in these behaviors. But there are many different types of native bee that we have here in Oregon and in the Pacific Northwest. And we'll start with bumblebees. And so bumblebees are a group of bees in the genus Bombus. And so they're the only group of native bees that have some kind of a social dynamic or a colony dynamic. And they'll have a queen that does all of the egg laying and then worker bees that take care of all of the other non-reproductive tasks in the hive. But where they differ from honeybees, they don't produce honey. And so they don't have that spoil-proof food to survive on all season, but they will kind of die out toward the end of the season and then send out reproductive individuals. And so they'll send out queens and drones to go out and mate. And then once mated queens are kind of toward the end of the season, they'll find a place to burrow and hibernate. And there are many different species of bumblebee in the Pacific Northwest. These are some of the stars that you might see more commonly. I would hazard a guess that this one makes a lot of appearances in your gardens, or you'll see them on your walks. This is the yellow-faced bumblebee, and I kind of chose an awkward angle here, but they have a great big tuft of yellow fuzz right on their face. It goes down and it almost looks like a nose. And so that's how you can kind of tell them apart. But they also have this really thin strip of yellow toward the back. Some other common species that we'll see here a lot, you might see a fuzzy horned or Bombus mixtus quite often. There is a white-shouldered bumblebee that has kind of this tuft of white hair right over the shoulder by the front wing. Brown belted, there's California's bumblebee, there's Bombus melanopygus. You'd think that the orange band toward the center would be the more defining feature for this one, but there are also many other species that have kind of that same rusty patch of hair, but this one has a little tip, a couple of bands of black hair toward the tip of their abdomen, and so they're referred to as black-tailed bumblebees. And so all of these will go through a really similar life cycle. This is an illustration done by Alex Lucas that I really love that kind of shows the bumblebee life cycle through the seasons. And so here, right in winter, we've got a queen bumblebee coming out of her burrow. She will find a new place to make a nest. And so most bumblebees will excavate little nests underground. Sometimes they'll find abandoned rodent dens. The black-tailed bumblebee melanopygus has been known in this area to find birdhouses to make nests inside of. It's not unheard of. But right at first, that queen bumblebee will excavate a little nest and then she'll make these little wax pots. So what we were looking at in this picture, so this is a bumblebee colony that's been bred and reared for either agricultural purposes or for behavioral experiments, but you can see they have these little wax pots, and inside those wax pots is where the queen will lay eggs, where those eggs will hatch and the larvae will go through all of their development and all of their pupation until they're able to emerge as an adult with wings. So she'll make a really small nest at first. And so she'll excavate a little hole. Usually she'll keep it very small because it's easier to defend from other animals that are looking for burrows at that time. Actually successfully starting a nest and finding a good spot for a queen bumblebee is pretty difficult. And so they're not often very successful when they are first attempting this. And they may be thwarted by birds and rodents and all kinds of things that are looking for burrows around similar times of year. But she'll start with just a really small brood. So brood is her young that she's taken care of early on in the season, and she'll be the one that goes out and forages for nectar and pollen to come back and feed them. And as her worker bees, or as her daughters start emerging, they will help take care of a lot of those non-reproductive duties. And so once they start emerging and can take on some of those tasks, the queen will remain inside the burrow and take care of all of her young. And then the worker bees will be the ones that go out and forage and gather resources and defend the nesting site and anything else that needs to happen. And the queen can be free just to lay eggs. And then toward the end of that season, most of the workers and the queen, they'll start raising virgin queens and males, male bees. So all worker bees are female, but they are non-reproductive, and so they're sterile and don't lay any eggs, but they will help their mother raise sisters and brothers that can go out and mate. So we'll have virgin queens and drones that will start emerging in the fall. And so really when you see the great big bees flying around, the great big fuzzy ones that are larger than most of the bumblebees that you're commonly seeing throughout most of the season, it'll usually be early in the spring or late in the fall. And so those fall queens will be the ones that will then burrow and hibernate, and often they'll find debris piles or leaves or soft earth that they can bed down in and hibernate in through the winter season and through the cold months until the whole cycle starts over again. All right, so the next group of bees I'd like to talk about are solitary. So remember we talked about solitary bees making up about 90% of all of the bee species that we have in North America. Of those, so about 70% are nesting in the ground. So they'll find a suitable nesting site depending on the species. Often families of bees will have similar nesting preferences for soil type and location, but usually it'll be non-compact earth, often on a slope, often with kinds of ground cover over the top. So things like low growing plant life. So it could be like a wild strawberry is really great for ground cover that has kind of the bare patches underneath that the bees can burrow into, often ferns and things like that that are low growing or on slopes, or berries or brambles where solitary bees will nest. But essentially, they'll excavate a little tunnel and then they will have these little chambers that branch off from that main channel. And so the female then will go out and gather pollen. She'll bring it back to the nesting site. She'll groom all that pollen off into a little ball called bee bread. And it's kind of like a little pollen loaf or sticky. They'll mix it with a little bit of nectar to keep it all sticking together. She'll lay an egg on it. And when that egg hatches, it'll eat all of the food. This little larva will eat all of the food left behind by its mother. And then once it reaches its full larval size and eats all of the food left behind, it'll pupate. And so sometimes they'll spin a little cocoon and these pupae will develop into a fully formed adult in their nest underground. So adults, generally the ones who are nesting and taking care of all of this, so usually it's the female bee that takes care of it. Early in the season is when the males will also emerge from their nesting site. They'll mate and then they've done their job and they don't have, they're not active for the rest of the season. So then it's just the female bees. they'll be doing all of this in a period of usually just 4 to 6 weeks. And so you don't see adult activity for solitary ground nesting bees of one species or one type for a very extended period throughout the season. So it's just a 4 to 6 week, really quick adult cycle. And then you'll have the juveniles that develop inside their nest for the rest of the season. And then those will hibernate in some form, either as a prepupa, so in kind of a diapause or a stasis form of a very large larvae before they pupate, or as a pupa through the winter. And then they'll dig their way out of their tunnel during their active season as an adult in the next year. So all of these bees that are being left behind by this lady will be the bees that are nesting and doing all of the brood rearing and care next year. So these are some common solitary ground nesting bees. So I tried to grab some from many different families, but this is an incredibly diverse group of bees. There are, we'll start with sweat bees. So there are a group of bees that are all kind of designated as sweat bees that gather minerals. They get their name sweat from gathering salt and minerals from sweat, but they'll also get it from mud puddles and other diverse sources, sometimes done in the wild. But there are many different genera of sweat bees. And so we've got Halictus, and so these are generally referred to as large sweat bees. And they're a little bit larger in body. Generally, they will carry pollen on their legs, and they'll have kind of this striped blonde and brown hair on the backs of their abdomens or on their segments. There's a Lasioglossum, and so these are very, very small sweat bees. I came across a field of dandelions this last season, and just about every dandelion I looked in had a tiny little sweat bee from that Lasioglossum genus in it, and it was really cool to see. But they can be very prolific. So if there's a good nesting site, you'll often have a big aggregation of them kind of all nesting together, and then they'll all forage usually off of similar resources and take advantage of them all in the same area, which can be true for a lot of different ground nesting bees or bees that have found a good nesting site. You'll get a bunch of them moving in all at the same time, even though they're solitary. And so you'll have this aggregation of solitary bees that are all utilizing the same nesting habitat or all the same nesting resource, but having their own individual nests in it. And then these are the really gorgeous kind of active summer bees. These ones always signal when it's officially summer to me. So this is a green metallic sweat bee, and they have this vibrant emerald jewelry head and thorax, and then a black and white, a very striking, yellow and black striping on their abdomens. And then also later in the season, you might see some longhorn bees. And so this is the family Melisodes. And so these will get their name. So the males have incredibly long antennae. It's how they got their name longhorn. But the females also have an exaggerated feature that I love to point out. They have these great big pollen pants or fluffy pollen collecting hairs on their back legs. And when they're loaded with pollen, it's kind of dry packed onto these incredible leg hairs. It looks like leg warmers, and it's really fun to see. They'll often be found in open face flowers. Like if you have sunflowers, I would guess that you'll have longhorn bees, often many of them all on the same head of sunflower at once, and they're great to see. Mining bees, usually these will be active earlier in the spring. So this is the genus Andrena. They're often identified by having these really great eyebrows. And so they have kind of this fuzz, this downy fuzz right in between their eyes, blonde hair. And they kind of look like a very small honeybee, but with those great eyeballs. And rather than having divots on their back legs for carrying like big balls of pollen like honeybees do. They have just soft hairs. And then, so I put these bees in this group as well of solitary ground nesters, even though they don't technically nest. And so earlier I mentioned brood parasites. And so there are many different species. There's a very, very diverse group of bees that don't actually nest for themselves. They won't gather pollen or other resources to take care of their own young, but rather they will specialize on parasitizing another type of bee's nest. And so this is a cuckoo bee, and there are different families of cuckoo bee that will kind of specialize on different types of bees to parasitize. But this one, I believe often parasitizes mining bee nests, but I'm not totally sure on that, so don't quote me. But basically, they will find a nesting site of their host species. They will lay their eggs in the nest of the other species, and that egg will hatch and outcompete the larvae of the host species. And so they'll eat all of the pollen and the food left behind by the other bee mother. And that takes away the necessity of this bee to nest and then feed it its own food. So these are not quite as common as the many other different species, but generally scientists who are surveying for species diversity and species richness really like to see cuckoo bees because it generally signals that there's a really healthy or really good population of their host species around. And so they can be incredibly informative to see out in the wild when they're around. All right, so I'll move on to solitary tunnel nesters or hole nesters. These are in the family Megachilidae. And so these make up the other group of solitary bees that aren't nesting in the ground. And they will nest in secondary holes above ground. And so that might be holes in dead wood. It might be pithy stems that are hollowed out. But basically, they will nest in holes that they just find that are the right size and the right length, the right diameter. And those diameter and length preferences will vary between species. And so often they'll kind of take up different parameters or different types of nesting materials out in the wild. But there are many species that humans have actually started rearing for pollination services. And so we've kind of cracked the code on the types of tunnels that they like to nest in, and then provide bee houses or great big nesting site aggregations to have many different many individuals of one species in throughout the season. So those would be like leafcutter bees and mason bees. We consider those types of bee houses or those nesting blocks that we put up artificial nesting sites because they're not going out and finding a hole to nest in out in the wild on their own. So it would be a little bit different if you had dead wood or something on your property that naturally had holes in it and you had bees from the family Megachilidae finding it and nesting in it. That wouldn't be considered an artificial one, but if you're putting up a house enclosure that has cardboard tubes or reeds or nesting blocks or trays in it, then it would be considered artificial, and there's a little bit more responsibility involved in maintaining those nesting sites and making sure that they are healthy. So some very common species that we'll see in the Pacific Northwest. I'll start with the most common of mason bee. So this is Osmia lignaria, or the blue orchard mason bee, and the one that is most commonly raised for pollination services. They're largely used for apple pollination and orchard pollination. They're active very early in the season. And so when those fruit trees and early blooming plants start coming out, they're the ones that will be flying early on in that season and taking advantage of that nectar and pollen, bringing it back to feed their young and pollinating that fruit. And so they are raised and often sold commercially in cocoons for people to populate artificial houses or habitats on their properties. Kind of along a similar vein, we have leaf-cutting bees. And so this one, Megachile rotundata, or the alfalfa leaf-cutting bee, is also raised for a lot of pollination services, particularly for alfalfa, but they're active in the summertime. And so you have these solitary tunnel nesters that have very similar life strategies, but they're separated in time by their active season. And so mason bees, you can kind of consider the springtime solitary tunnel nesters, and leaf cutters you could recognize as the summertime or the later season solitary tunnel nesters. So this is a Western leaf cutter that is also used a lot for pollination services and will be sold commercially as well. And then there are some non-native species of mason and leaf cutting bee that have been introduced over the Rockies. I actually think the alfalfa leaf cutter is one such species, but this one here, this is Osmia cornifrons. This is a horn-faced mason bee that actually is an Asian species that was introduced to North America. I'm not sure if it was intentional or unintentional, but they've taken over a lot of urban mason bee habitats now, and you can't really get away from them at this point, but they are a little bit daintier in body. They have kind of this light fuzz, and then they've got little horns on the front of their face. I tried to find a good shot of that here, this side shot. And then this is another species of leaf cutter. I believe this is a male, and that the kind of grabby part at the back of his abdomen would be his genitalia, which is how you'd be able to tell. And then there are other types of bees that will nest in holes and things like this as well. So this is also another kind of leaf cutter. I believe it's a European species that has now been seen throughout North America and Oregon quite a bit. And they have this really striking black and yellow coloration. They're really gorgeous, but there are other kind of more wild or less cultivated species like resin bees. They will collect sticky plant resins to nest with, and they're not managed or bred quite as much for pollination because of that plant material that they use makes their nests really difficult to open and makes them a little bit more vulnerable to being manipulated in any way. But the general life cycle for all of them is going to be the same, but it will be often at different times of year and then sometimes using different nesting materials. But we'll use mason bees, that's the standard example. And so they'll be the first ones that come out in spring when temperatures are usually above 55 degrees or so. Males will emerge first, and they have that very short window of activity or very short lifespans. And so the females will then come out afterwards, they will mate, and then it is a female dominated world for the rest of the season. And so that adult female will gather pollen, she'll bring it back to the nest, she'll make those pollen loaves, kind of similar to the diagram of those solitary ground nesting bees I showed earlier, but she'll do it in her tunnel. And so she'll crawl all the way back to the back of that tunnel, she'll make that little pollen loaf, she'll lay an egg on it, and then she'll go out and gather nesting materials to seal the chamber. And so for mason bees, that's mud. They have these great big mandibles. So one of the ways to really identify a megachilid out like on a flower would be from having these kind of oversized jaws. So this is the mason bee, she'll use that to scoop up mud. And then in the case of a leaf cutter, she'll use that to cut leaves that she'll use to line her little brood cells or brood chambers inside of her nest. But she'll grab mud, she'll bring it back, and she'll build walls or little segments in between the little chambers where she's laid eggs, and that will keep them from stealing food from one another, but also it is kind of a defense mechanism from parasites and from spreading mites and things like that throughout different chambers. And so that kind of looks like this here. You can see the developing bee. So you've got little cocoons in here that are separated by mud walls. And then once she's filled her entire tube, she'll put a mud cap at the end. Usually it's very thick, or it'll have kind of a buffer region, like a cap, an empty space, and then a cap again. And that is to prevent predation or parasitization from other things like wasps or beetles or anything else that might try to eat her young. And then for the rest of the season, so usually this is done by June. And for the rest of the season, you'll have young that are just eating the food left behind by their mother, growing into great big large larvae that will then eventually spin a cocoon and pupate. And then they'll hibernate inside of those cocoons as fully formed adults through the winter and until next spring, when they'll start emerging from their cocoons to start the cycle over again. Ooh. I apologize for the loud music startling, but this is a closer look at mason bee development. So that is that larva that is spinning a cocoon inside the cell. So my partner, Emily Parker for Bee in Bloom, took these videos and made that time lapse. And then this is a closer look at a mason bee chewing his way out of the cocoon in early spring using those great big mandibles. All right. And so that is kind of the general life cycle that will be utilized by other megachilid bees as well. But the time of season that they're active in, and then the type of nesting materials that they use to line their nests and to cushion their brood cells and separate them and protect them will be a little bit different. So now we're going to kind of segue into more conservation-based topics. So how we can actually support bees through their life cycles and specifically through the winter. And so there are three main things that I'm going to focus on for the rest of the presentation tonight. So the first one is the Leave the Leaves campaign, preserving natural nesting types or creating nesting sites for bees on your property, and then planning your pollinator landscape. So that will focus mostly on plants and planting for them. So we'll start with Leave the Leaves, and this is a popular hashtag. So this campaign was started by Society, which is a really great science-based nonprofit for invertebrate conservation. They have a lot of amazing resources available to the public. And anyone who's interested in topics like this, I'd definitely check out Xerces, that's xerces.org, to learn more about Leave the Leaves or why you might do that or how you might get involved with spreading the word. But then also they have a lot of really great conservation resources. A lot of them are pollinator specific, but they have a lot for aquatic invertebrates and other things that play really important roles in our ecosystems. So the idea behind Leave the Leaves is that you are putting ground cover in to protect, or leaving ground cover, natural ground cover, in areas where you might have hibernating bumblebee queens or butterfly and moth pupae that are in diapause that are waiting to come out next year. There are lots of beetles and snails and worms and millipedes and mites and other things that play really important roles in our ecosystems, like those millipedes and mites are really important detritivores. And so they'll actually eat a lot of the food of these leaves, or a lot of that plant matter. It'll decay down and then it makes a really great fertilizer. And so if you leave the leaves in your gardens, and even if you have turf grass, leaving leaves can help fertilize your lawns as well. And I personally, I don't know if this is a controversial statement, but I would like to wage war against leaf blowers at this point. I think now, since doing all of the work over Zoom, a lot of people are working over Zoom. I think more and more of us are on a bit of a tirade against leaf blowers these days, but also it is just a really important resource to leave behind for those hibernating bumblebee queens specifically. And then it'll support a lot of other wildlife through the winter as well, because birds and squirrels and things will find little tasty snacks in those leaves to subsist on through the winter as well. And so that's important. We're going to dive into preserving nesting sites a little bit. So really what that means in urban areas or on farms or other spaces that you might have that you're trying to incorporate a little bit more wildlife habitat into is something that's a little bit less managed or a little bit less pristine. And so turf grass is really the enemy of nesting sites. Also, mulching can take up a lot of nesting sites. So mulching in between plantings will take up areas that solitary bees might nest in. And so a lot of times what that means is just not allowing turf grass or not mulching down, and then having kind of untrafficked or patchy ground where bees can burrow into or excavate their little tunnel nests into. Sometimes bumblebees will find a nice covered area. Usually bumblebees will find a place that has a little bit more protection. So like they'll find little parts in rock walls or on slopes that have extra ground cover, but also putting in low growing plants that spread out via rhizome can also provide really great protection for ground nests as well. That makes it a little bit more sheltered. But also sometimes, so mining bees, those little andrinas, the ones that have the eyebrows, they will nest in areas that don't have cover. And so having nice, flat, good sun exposure, sometimes that means having it in a south or southeast facing area that isn't mowed, doesn't have a lot of traffic, isn't mulched, and doesn't have much turf grass. Even patchy turf grass is sometimes okay, but they'll burrow in kind of sandy soil in those areas as well. So having that ground cover always isn't always important for preserving nesting sites for solitary ground nesting bees, but it can be really important for many different species. Okay, so then I mentioned dead wood, and having dead wood that has beetle bored holes in it can provide nesting sites for those secondary hole nesters, like the native mason bees and resin bees and leaf cutting bees. And that can mean just letting down logs stack up, or having dead wood in areas of your property in order to have nesting solitary bees. You could also drill holes in them to kind of get them started, but you wouldn't want to have too dense of an aggregation of them all in one area, so that you don't have kind of overpopulation necessarily. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute here. But having things like brambles can also be very, very important for allowing nesting sites. And so a lot of these principles for providing nesting sites for wildlife and for bees specifically kind of means reassessing our idea of what's beautiful or what is aesthetically pleasing in our yards, because I think we have these very clean lines are pleasing to humans. So having, like your areas of grass, and then your pollinator gardens and, rows of plantings is very pleasing to us, to, kind of make order in nature. But a lot of times having these kind of more natural, more chaotic areas in our properties is a lot more conducive to supporting wildlife and bees. And so it would be more about appreciating having that wildlife around or having those bees around and supporting them. That would be kind of the refactoring or the reprioritization that we need to make. But also you can have compromises. And so it's not all or nothing. So a lot of times with your spaces that you're working in, it is going to be specifically about your goals and what you want to do. And if you can sacrifice, a little portion of your yard or a spot maybe that you don't go into that often, have kind of that more natural or chaotic area for nesting, then you can do that. But also, priority number one is going to be having a space that you enjoy, because those are the ones that you will upkeep more. And so if that means, I'm able to put pollinator plants in and provide nectar and pollen, but I'm not, willing to have a stack of dead wood, then, that is totally fine, of course. And so it's not an all or nothing thing. It's all about finding your personal sweet spot. But this would be an ideal setup in the sense for wildlife. All right. And so if you do have artificial nesting sites, so that would be like bee houses that have cardboard tubes or natural reeds or nesting blocks for those solitary bees we talked about, it is going to be really important to manage them, especially now because we have an invasive pest that is kind of sweeping through a lot of our artificial nesting sites called the Houdini fly. And so it's really important to actually open up your nesting sites, all of your nesting materials, harvest your cocoons, so remove them, separate them from debris, separate any parasitized cocoons, to rinse them and then store them through the winter to protect them before putting them out in the spring again. So cleaning. So what I just described is specifically for mason bees, and that's what you would do in October or right before winter after they've fully gone through their life cycle. They're those adult bees hibernating inside of their cocoons. It's a little bit different for bees that are active later in the season. So specifically, if you're managing leaf cutting bees, the process will be different. So leaf cutting bees hibernate through the winter as diapause larvae. So I mentioned that a little bit earlier when we were talking about different types of solitary bees and how they might hibernate through that cold season in different life stages. So in the case of leaf cutting bees, they're active later in the season, and so they have less time to develop while it's still warm. And so heat is a really critical element for larvae and for developing bees, because they need that energy in order to move and to eat and to digest. And so leaf cutters don't have the same amount of that warm season to do all of that before winter hits. And so they will eat until they're great big larvae, and they don't have the heat or the external energy to kick into their pupation. And so they'll hibernate just as a little larva or a little grub. And so they'll kind of go into a stasis. And then when spring comes around is when they'll actually pupate. And so we don't want to mess with our leaf cutting bees at the same time as we mess with our mason bees. So when we manage our mason bee nests, we'll pull the tubes and harvest them in October. Whereas with leaf cutting bees, you can pull the tubes out at the end of the season as well. So in October, you can take everybody in, but then you'd store your leaf cutting bee tubes in some kind of an enclosure. So something that's breathable. It could be a box or an organza bag. So we use these mesh organza bags that have a drawstring usually. They've worked really well, they're a good size. And store them kind of at ambient temperature, so in a garage or a basement or a shed, where they're a little bit more protected from predators and from weather through the winter. And then you wouldn't actually harvest those cocoons until springtime. So when you're putting your mason bees out is when your leaf cutting bees will actually pupate. And that's when you can open up the nesting materials and pull them out and store them at warm temperatures. And so all of this, so this whole process is a little bit more in depth. There are different tricks and tips and things that you can utilize to make it easier. And we have a little how-to video linked out here. So I mentioned earlier, you'll have access to tonight's slides via email afterwards. And that is a succinct how-to video that shows the whole process step by step, and then some of the things to look out for. And so definitely check that out. And then for the rest of this evening, I'm going to talk a little bit more about planning out your pollinator landscape. And so wintertime, it is a little bit too late to seed perennials this year, but you can often, as you're going into winter and doing things like leaving your leaves and doing your conservation efforts for winter, you can plant or you can seed perennials, and they'll go through a cold season, which is actually really good for their root development. And so you'll have perennials that come out in the spring that will have better roots than if you plant them in the spring. And so there are a few different kind of methods or ways that you can incorporate pollinator plants into your landscapes. So this is a hedgerow. So Bee and Bloom, we operate out of a farm called Willow Bar Farm on Sauvie Island. And so this is a hedgerow there. This is actually a couple of years ago. So this is looking really young here, but now it is all quite large, and there are blooms happening at some part of this hedgerow all warm season long, which is really great. So it can be important to plan ahead and know the blooming times of the plants that you choose, so that you can have blooms that are occurring through all of the stages of the warm part of the season. So from March until October generally is the hope. You can also do bee lawns. And so if you're sick of turf grass, if you're sick of mowing, you can get rid of your turf grass altogether. And there are a couple of methods for doing that that I won't dive into, but there are some great videos on the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District YouTube channel that you can watch about sheet mulching, which is a really good way of getting rid of turf grass so that you can put in what I like to refer to as bee lawns. And I'm not the one that came up with that. I think the University of Minnesota utilizes that term a lot. So bee lawns are kind of little meadowscapes that flower throughout different stages of the season. I just read a really great article about trash cells. So the hills that have trash in landfills that were previously planted with turf grass and mowed, they've started converting them into meadowscapes for pollinators and doing pollinator plantings over them. And a lot of times what that means is just seeding cover crops. So things like meadow foam, which is a great Oregon cover crop that blooms early in the season, and then clovers and things that bloom later in the season, like buckwheat, can provide a lot of really great food, pollen, and nectar for bees later in the season. And so having these blooming spaces that are low to the ground that take up what previously may have been lawn space and provide a lot of food for bees and other pollinators throughout the season. It's a really, really great way to add to your landscape. Then you can have specifically designated pollinator gardens or areas. You can have raised beds. You could utilize, potted plants and container gardening in order to put in pollinator-friendly plants. But also when you are planning your pollinator landscape, and what I do recommend, I apologize for that again, what I recommend is kind of drawing out or gridding out your space that you're working in. And then if you are able to integrate nesting sites into those plans ahead of time, maybe in the fall or before going into winter or during the winter, you can take advantage of having an inside activity that is a little satisfying about planning your outdoor spaces, but actually integrating several different aspects of this, or integrating nesting sites into your plans. And that might be as simple as, okay, I have these hedgerows and I will not put wood mulch down in between them, and that'll utilize or that will accommodate nesting sites for ground nesting bees in between these perennial plantings. And that may mean a little bit more of a compromise where you have to go in and do more weeding in the early years, but eventually the goal is that it will be a little bit more self-sustaining after several years of growth. And so when it comes to perennials, these are some favorites. And here we have a video. So this is by my partner, Emily, again, and she took footage of all of the different types of pollinators, all of the different animals that will feed on goldenrod. And so goldenrod is a really amazing late blooming plant that supports tons of different insect species. And so you'll have wasps and bees and flies and moths and butterflies and all kinds of animals that do visit these blooms, and they provide a lot of nectar and a lot of pollen. But this is a general list of the ones that we like to utilize most. And if you are able to kind of plan ahead and have some that bloom early in the season, so like this red flowering currant blooms really early in the season. Foxglove starts to bloom pretty early in the season as well, and then lead into ones that bloom later on. So like goldenrod and aster and fireweed will bloom later. Catmint blooms for a long time and is a nice, great big plant. But you can incorporate them all together. And so you can, in the springtime, get starts or plants of perennials to put into different spaces. And often when you're purchasing starts, and with seeds as well, but it's a little bit more exacting when you're utilizing starts and when you're putting the small plant in. You can plan for how large it's going to be and how much space it needs based on instructions often provided by nurseries, which is really helpful. But we really like seeding. And so this is a pollinator meadowscape project that was worked on mostly by Emily again, over by our hives on Sabi Island. And so she really focused on making a mix that had annuals that would bloom right away. And so when you're making a seed mix, it's nice to have that kind of instant gratification that season of something that's going to bloom. And so having an annual like that cover crop meadow foam is really great. Or there are some annual lupins. And I won't go over all of these, but it is really nice to incorporate or make sure that you have some annuals that will kind of give you that instant gratification in your first season. And then you can incorporate perennials that will be a little bit longer lived and may take a little bit longer to reach maturity. Sometimes they won't even bloom in their first season. And so it'll be a little bit slower of a burn, but have a little bit more long-term payoff. And so then these are the seeds that were utilized in the seed mix for our project out at the farm. And you will have access to this, like I mentioned before, if you wanted to replicate it. But you can really customize your own based on the location you have. So, you know, if you're putting it in as a rain garden, you might have lots of water. And so you need things that survive in wetter soil. And also, I guess in rain gardens, you have kind of that gradation, right, where you have things incorporated that are drought tolerant and need a lot of wet soil. And so make sure that you're kind of considering that. And then, of course, sunlight is going to be the other consideration, and size. And that will kind of conclude tonight's presentation. So these are some additional resources I've put together for you as you're planning out your landscapes and as you're working to help bees on your property. So like I mentioned, this presentation will be recorded and put on the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District YouTube channel. They already have an amazing arsenal of webinars available and on their channel. And then I did one specifically with Andrew from the Soil and Water Conservation District about plants and pollinators that highlight some really great plants that bloom at different times of season and a lot of their requirements. And so if you're interested in diving deeper in that, certainly check that one out. Of course, soil and water conservation districts also have native plant sales where you can get starts for very affordable prices. Xerces Society, I mentioned earlier, they have plant lists. This is an amazing resource on how you can choose pollinator seed mixes or even construct your own pollinator seed mix for your area and for your goals. And then the Audubon Backyard Habitat Certification is something many people are doing. They're actually becoming certified. And I think there are a lot of perks, like you can get discounts at plant nurseries and things like that. And a lot of times they have cost sharing and grant funding for doing plantings or for creating wildlife habitat in your backyards or in small farms or in urban and suburban areas. And definitely stay in touch with me throughout your bee journey. If there's anything that I can help with, or if you need clarification on things, you can reach me at this email address. And then I'd like to have a special thanks to, of course, Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District for putting this on and promoting it and getting you all here with us tonight. But then also Emily Parker provided a lot of really amazing photographs and videos. And she's actually hosting tonight's webinar as well, and will be joining us in a second here for Q&A. So if you have any questions or anything you'd like clarification on from the presentation, go ahead and throw your questions in the chat and Emily will read them and we can answer those for you with the remaining time tonight. So thanks so much for listening.
Hi, everyone. This is Emily. Becca, that was wonderful. Thanks so much for that.
Okay.
All right.
I will also go ahead and throw my email address in the chat as well. So as things come up, definitely feel free to contact me anytime. And then also, I'm just going to throw in some of the things that I mentioned that I feel like are most crucial. So there's xerces.org. And if, something I didn't mention, if anyone is particularly interested in types of bees and identifying them and kind of monitoring them and knowing what's in your gardens. There's a really amazing citizen science project and certification that's happening with Oregon State Extension called the Master Melitologist Program, or the Oregon Bee Project. And they've been working on cataloging and creating a map of all of the bee species in Oregon over the last, I think, 3 or 4 years. But that is the Master Melitologist, hopefully I'm spelling this right, Melitologist Program with OSU Extension. And then there's the Oregon Bee Project. And I'm going to just double check and see if that's .org or .com really quick. .org. All right. And all right, so I did also mention earlier, so there was the Portland Audubon backyard habitat, and I'll just put in a link to all of their really amazing resources as well. It doesn't look like we've had any inquiries so far, or any questions. So I hope we're not experiencing any technical difficulties or anything like that, or maybe there just aren't any tonight. But as I said before, so my email address is in the chat here. Please feel free to contact me anytime with any questions. And you will have access to this recording. You will be able to kind of watch that at your leisure. You'll have access to the presentation slides and the links on those slides to the follow-up resources I discussed. And all right, I guess I could stay on the line for a couple more minutes just in case anybody has any more questions. Oh, yes, thank you, Jan. I'm so glad you joined us and that you enjoyed the program tonight. Stay in touch for sure. Don't be a stranger.
Another one, Becca, that I thought of was the Bumblebee Watch.
Really appreciate you all having interest in these topics and joining us tonight. And all right. All right. I guess that's where I'll leave you guys tonight. Thank you so much for your patience, and thank you, Chris, for joining, and Scott. Thanks. Awesome. So there are people here tonight. That's so great. Definitely stay in touch and have a really wonderful rest of your evening and great winter season and all of the things that go along with that. And we'll see you around.